Okay guys, so there's been a ton of Starfield news coming out of Gamescom. Like what happens at the start of the game, precisely how big this game is, and just how many hours of gameplay there are. We'll explore all of that in this video, but let's start with what for me is the most exciting. This comes from an interview with Pete Hines. Now, Pete is the head of publishing at Bethesda Softworks, so he knows better than anyone how many hours you'll be able to sink into the game. And he had a very exciting thing to say about just how many hours you can expect to play it for. Pete claims one playthrough could easily last at least 1,000 hours. In the interview, he talks about how he likes to see if he can spend a week purely in space and see what it's like to be in space, just landing on star stations, derelict ships, and never once setting foot on a planet. Then afterwards, he'll see how long he can stay in one city, how many factions he can find, how many quests he can do, and then he'll reach a decision point where he has to pick a side. At which point Pete says, quote, "I'll make a save and I'll play this way and go 2 hours down the road just to see, and then rewind and play 2 hours the other direction, because I want to know what should our players expect. Just trying to do that as many times as possible, just land on a random planet and start walking. The more you do that, the more you find there's 1,000 hours in this version of the game alone." Now that's massively exciting news. Pete's not only saying here that there's 1,000 hours of gameplay in Starfield, which alone would make it a monster game, he's saying there's 1,000 hours of gameplay in one path of Starfield. So for example, you could spend 1,000 hours in one city alone without seeing another area. Or you could spend your time predominantly in space and spend 1,000 hours there before you even touch down on a planet. Or maybe you want to dedicate all your time to building the most epic outpost you can. Whatever path you choose, according to Pete Hines, there's 1,000 hours of gameplay there, meaning there's tens of thousands of hours in the game total. Exciting news. Elsewhere in the interview, he details just how massive the game is, and not in terms of gameplay hours, but physical size, physical playing space. He says, quote, "We made an irresponsibly large game. We take it to another level. We've seen it ourselves. I was talking to a couple of folks from another office. They played about 40 hours, 60 hours, but their experiences were like, we didn't do any of the same things at all, not even close," end quote. So you can literally play for 60 hours, which is more than the length of most games, and not see any of the same things as someone else who's also played for 60 hours. You might head to a planet and hunt creatures, while another person might become a space pirate and hijack ships high above the atmosphere. Now, there is one part of the interview I'm a bit worried about, and it's this bit. Pete says how locations aren't the same for every person. You can't just tell someone to go to a location and find something on a planet, because it might not be there in that person's game. This is pretty worrying for me because it means planets are fully randomized. If we both land on the same planet, the layout of the geography will be completely different in our different versions of the game. For me, this suggests Starfield is less handcrafted than we thought. And you might say, you know, we knew planets were going to be procedurally generated, because how else would they have 1,000 planets in the game? They can't obviously handcraft them all. But I don't think Bethesda has ever actually addressed the fact each game has its own randomized versions of planets. I've been following this game for a while and I really don't think they have said that, but if they have said that, do let me know in the comments. Pete frames it as a good thing though, like he says each player gets to have a unique experience, but I really don't know about that. I would rather that Starfield's universe was consistent among everyone's experience, so we can trade stories of our shared experience in that universe. We can also swap the locations of rare weapons and armor, or you could say like, oh, watch out for this area, there's a high level monster there. I don't want to be too pessimistic at this stage, but for me, it just seems like there's slightly less excitement exploring a planet that's just been randomly thrown together in your version of the game alone. And everyone's exploring these different randomized versions of planets. Anyway, moving on to another cool bit of Starfield news, and this is the last bit from Pete before we move on. He details how the fun level in Starfield is still intact. He says, quote, "It's still fun. It's supposed to be about fun. We make a game that is about freedom. We embrace chaos chaos and we give players more freedom than I think people really dare to in their games. That's part of what makes Starfield special, and that creates situations that we have to do a lot of work to make sure this doesn't break, this does not create problems, end quote. So despite the massive size of the game and the sheer amount of hours you can put into it, Bethesda hasn't lost sight of the primary purpose of the game, that it's meant to be fun, which is really promising news. That's not the only Starfield update we got from Gamescom. Moving on to Bethesda director Todd Howard, he gave an interesting interview where he touched on the feeling of playing Starfield. He says it's hard to express how big the game feels when you play it. Oh, there's a planet, I can go and land over there. You sit down and say you'll play for half an hour and 6 hours go by. The more you put into Starfield, he says, the more it gives back, which again speaks not only to how long you can play Starfield for and the amount of content there is in the game, but also just how immersive it is. As Todd says, you can completely forget you're playing it. And I've personally had many times where I've been playing Skyrim or Fallout 4 and I've just forgotten it's a video game. Like, it actually becomes real life to me. And I fully expect loads of those moments in Starfield. Todd also revealed what happens at the start of the game. Now, this is exciting, but I will say there are spoilers here, so if you don't want to know what happens at the start of the game, skip ahead about 30 seconds. So here's what happens at the start of Starfield according to Todd Howard. Basically, some people at Gamescom were able to play a short gameplay demo which happens at the start of Starfield, and it's essentially the prologue. So you start out as a miner and you touch an artifact that makes you see into space-time. Then you create a character and you're off on an adventure. You'll join Constellation, a group calling themselves the Last Space Explorers. According to Howard, they're like NASA meets Indiana Jones, and their mission is to search for artifacts. So that's going to be your driving mission throughout Starfield. Search the stars for artifacts and have crazy adventures along the way. It won't be long before we're doing that as well, and I absolutely cannot wait. There's not long to go now. August 31st is when you can play if you grab the premium edition, although it is quite expensive. It's like $100. So it's September 6th if you grab the standard edition, which is slightly less expensive. Or if you're playing on Game Pass, it's also September 6th. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for very imminent Starfield guides.